You might wonder, what did AT&T think about all this, right? Because it was the biggest company in the world, really the largest company in the world by revenue. It employed an awful lot of people, had Bell Labs, very smart folks. And you know that they couldn't have just been unaware of this, right? It's not possible that they could have designed their network with this gaping hole and not have thought that anybody would do this. And it turns out that's exactly what happened at the start. I talked to several engineers from Bell Labs, really bright people, and they said, no, this caught us totally unawares. We had no idea. Who would do that? Who would? This is another recurring theme, right? You see the Germans doing this in World War II with the Enigma machine. Well, I mean, sure, I suppose you could break this crypto system, but you'd need warehouses full of people and computers that haven't been invented yet, which is exactly what the British had. And so it's a similar kind of a thing. Like, well, who would go to the trouble of it? That's insane. So, testifying before Congress, AT&T's head attorney for privacy and fraud in 1975 said, "At the time we recognized that we had no immediate defense to blue and black boxes. This was a breakthrough almost equivalent to the advent of gunpowder, where the hordes of Genghis Khan faced problems of a new sort, of the advent of the cannon." Now, I know this gentleman. He is an extraordinarily charismatic man and quite gifted in his words and his ability to horrify Congress with how important this is. The hordes of Genghis Khan, all this. So what did AT&T do? Well, starting in 1964 and ending in May of 1970, as an interim solution, because they're AT&T, they're Bell Labs, they're scientists, they're engineers, they said, we better understand exactly how big this problem is. Maybe it's big, maybe it's small. Maybe we can just hope that it goes away. And so they deployed these rapidly designed toll fraud surveillance units. This was a precursor to warrantless wiretapping. They set up 6 of these in different cities, and what it would do is a big machine. It lived in a locked cage in a central office. Not even the people in the central office really knew what it was, highly secret. And it randomly monitored toll calls looking for 2600 hertz when it shouldn't ought to be there. It randomly monitored 33 million phone calls. When it found one it thought there was evidence of fraud, it tape recorded it. And then, so they tape recorded between 1.5 and 1.8 million telephone calls during this 5-year period. 1.5, 1.8, who really knows? We may have lost 300,000 tapes. They would send these tapes to a service bureau in New York City where very senior operators would do nothing other than listen to these tapes to determine, oh, this one's fraudulent, this one's not. And during that time, they detected at least 25,000 cases of known illegality. Now, you have this classic problem. Okay, I now know that there is fraud on the network. I have some indication of how much fraud. I'd like to get these people arrested, but number one, I don't really want to publicize this, right? I mean, sure, there are classified ads in popular electronics, but it's not like on the front page of the New York Times, okay? So I'd prefer not to publicize this, number one. Number two, I don't really want to reveal the fact that we've been monitoring 33 million calls because, even if we, the phone company, believe that we have a right to do this, that's just really a conversation we'd really rather not have. And number three, it's not even really clear at this point what laws have these people broken. There's a fraud by wire law. It's a federal fraud by wire law, but the guy who wrote it, who for the Justice Department gave an opinion to AT&T saying, I really don't think this applies. It was really constructed for something entirely different. So what do? Well, what you do is you pick your cases very carefully. So you don't go after people who are just general phone freaks, hacker types. What you do is you go after the mob. Because it turns out that the mob did a lot of business in gambling and bookmaking. Very lucrative business, running what was called layoff betting, essentially sort of being like almost a reinsurance company for individual bookmakers. And the way you do this, if you're the mob, is you spend a lot of time on the phone, quoting odds. They call it the betting line, back and forth. The problem is the FBI is wise to this. And so what the FBI would do is they would say, we think that you are a mobster. We're going to get your toll records from the phone company. And we're going to look and see if you call other mobsters, and we're slowly going to roll up your network that way. So the mob looked at this and said, wow, this is great. This blue box and this black box thing, it's great, because not only does it allow me to make these calls, it doesn't leave any billing records. That's fantastic. So the FBI goes and looks at the billing records and says, this guy doesn't make any long-distance calls, huh? I guess he's not a mobster. So AT&T handed to the FBI, they rolled up this network. And so, FBI agents made simultaneous raids at 5 locations in Miami and blah, blah, blah. The arrest stemmed from the use of an electronic device known as a blue box. So this was what AT&T did initially. They said, we're going to cherry pick the cases. We're going to go after things where we know there's going to be public sympathy. The government is going to be eager to do this. There's even there's a wonderful memo I have from the Department of Justice saying, well, the organized crime people are pretty excited about going after these people with blue boxes. The rest of the Justice Department is sort of less interested in being AT&T's revenue enforcement arm. It just doesn't seem like a good use of the public funds. So this was essentially their MO until the 1970s. Now, during this time, you had all these sort of disparate little pockets of phone freaks all over the country. And they started in the late 60s and early 70s forming a community. And there were several things that were really key to that community. One was loop-arounds. Loop-arounds were this amazing thing. It was a test number that phone companies would provide where there'd be 2 numbers, like in California, they would typically end in 0045 and 0046. And they were used for measuring transmission loss. But when one person called 0045 and another person called 0046, you'd connect together. Loop-arounds had 2 things that were really neat. One was that they were anonymous. So I could tell you, call me, if you're a phone freak, call me at this loop around at 0046 at 10 p.m. on a Saturday night, because I'm probably not doing anything else at 10 p.m. on a Saturday night if I'm a phone freak. And if other phone freaks call it, I can talk to them, but I don't have to give out my phone number. That's cool. The second thing that's cool is frequently these things don't return answer supervision. To the phone company, it looks like they never answered, which is great because it means the call's free. So loop-arounds were super important. Another thing that was important were what was called party lines. These were essentially broken recordings, like you have reached a non-working number in the 238 exchange, and sometimes the levels on those would be set too low. Sometimes the recordings just wouldn't play. But what that meant was if other people called into them, they'd all be connected in a big conference call. Again, one of these things, right? Today, conference calls, yeah, okay, big whoop. But back then, it's like, oh my gosh, a conference call. This is amazing. We can communicate with one another. And then there were actual conference lines. 052 is one of them. 2111 is another famous one, which were actually intended to be conference lines that were internal to the phone company. And if you had a blue box, you could get into them. And so that was a really nice way for phone freaks in terms of filtering, because the only people who get onto them are other phone freaks, right? So that's pretty cool. So you have this community that is starting to form in the late 60s, early 70s, and then that community goes public in a very big way. Esquire magazine in October of 1971, with a cover entirely unrelated to phone freaking, did an article. A guy named Ron Rosenbaum wrote an article called Secrets of the Little Blue Box, a story so incredible it may even make you feel sorry for the phone company. And what's interesting about this is it was actually billed as fiction, but it clearly wasn't fiction. And in fact, that's because it wasn't fiction. But it was so well written and so interesting, and it made this fundamentally geeky, nerdy thing seem so cool that I don't know how many phone freaks I've talked to. I said, how did you get started in freaking? Oh, there was this article in this magazine, Esquire. And they don't remember the cover, but they remember this article. So this, and there were a couple other articles that came out around this time, but it really just completely blew the hobby wide open. And also in that year, 1971, a seminal year, the first Phone Freak newsletter was launched. It was something called the Youth International Party Line, or YIPL, and it later changed its name to the Technological American Party, or TAP, and then it changed its name again to the Technical Assistance Program. So it went through, it started out as an offshoot of the Yippie movement, and then became still a political movement, but more focused on technology and less on the Yippies, and then finally it sort of got out of politics altogether. It was really sort of, one of, there's a direct lineage there up to 2600, just about the same year that TAP stopped publication, 2600 started. And, at least one of the Hope organizers, Cheshire Catalyst, was, I think, the last editor of TAP. But so you have really this critical mass now of phone freaks, and you also have another thing happening, which is that it starts out with people who are really just interested in exploring the network. The mob gets involved a little bit. But then you also have now people who are just in it for the free calls, right? This is great. And then you have people, the TAP had things like, how to get electricity, how to make your gas meter run backwards by disassembling it, hooking up to a source of compressed air and spinning it backwards, and then rehooking it up to your gas line at your house. So it starts to go off into this whole sort of 1970s ripoff mentality. And so the phone freak hobby starts to change in different ways. And much like, as Jason was talking about yesterday, hackers, right? Hackers, and sometime around 1981 and 83, the meaning of the word hacker changes. The meaning of the word phone freak changes as well. And so it starts to have this dichotomy. So some of the more famous phone freaks that you will have heard about, Captain Crunch, John Draper, old photo there. And it turns out the Captain Crunch whistle that came as a prize in the Captain Crunch cereal box, if you covered up one of the holes, made 2,600 hertz. So if you blew your Captain Crunch whistle with one of those holes covered, you could basically be Joe Ingressia. And Steve Wozniak of Apple Computer there in his dorm room at Berkeley with a blue box. Now, if you're AT&T, you have a real headache now, right? The headache was a little bit of a problem before, but now it's a real problem because you can't let the newspapers start carrying articles about phone freaks and whatnot, and you can't let this go on. And so AT&T started getting serious. And they started, before it was fine, if we caught you with a blue box, we'd slap your hands and take it away, say don't do that again. But now we have to start prosecuting. And you can really feel for the dilemma that they're in, because it's like, every time we prosecute, there are newspaper stories. On the other hand, if we don't prosecute, there are still newspaper stories. So, what are we going to do? And so you see, the number of prosecutions just really ramp up. And these, by the way, these are from an AT&T memo on toll fraud. There may have been other prosecutions that AT&T was not directly involved in. So this is, indicative of a portion of the prosecutions. Now you'll see it peaks there in '75 and starts to fall away. That's because they got better at prosecuting, that there were other things that were focusing the minds of people, like personal computers started to come out around that time. And then also there was the first deployment of something called Common Channel Interoffice Signaling, CCIS, which was known as Signaling System Number 6. It's a forerunner to SS7 used today. The key thing that CCIS did is it sent the transmitted digits and answer supervision information out of band, meaning that it wasn't something you could just whistle 2,600 hertz to disrupt or send MF tones to disrupt. The signaling information was completely separate from the voice channel. And that was the first deployment in May of 1976. And so the handwriting was on the wall there.